Hello and welcome to this fourth video in the series of developing web applications with ASP.NET 4.5 using the WebForms paradigm. In the last video, video 3, we saw how we would create the model classes that are serving as business objects in our web application using Entity Framework. Today, the objective of the video is to show you how you can use these classes to retrieve data from the database, put data back into the database, and show this data using different data controls such as the grid view or the form view in your application's pages. So without further ado, let's jump back into the development environment where I've already fired up Visual Studio and loaded the solution as we have left it last time. So remember last time what we did was we added a new folder called BLL, short for Business Logic Layer, where we added a second folder called Model, in which we put three classes which represent the entities of my model. The first one being the toy category class, which represents a category of products which the web store is going to be presenting online. The second one is the product class, which will represent a toy entity, and the third being a product picture class, which is going to store pictures associated with each of the products which are going to be present on our website. And these entity classes also hold the relationships between them, where a toy category can have one or more products and a product can have one or more product pictures. We've also added the product context class, which allows us to store data in the database and retrieve data from the database using the web sample connection string, and the product model initializer class, which will be called the first time we access the database to see the database with some fictitious data. So today we're going to be returning to a page we built in video number 2, which is the categories.aspx page. And in this categories.aspx page, if we jump back into design view, you see that I've already added a category listings heading, and this is a little bit large for my taste. So I'm going to jump back into the code source view of the page and watch what happens when I change the H2 heading into something like strong. So you see that the ending tag or the closing tag also got changed by Visual Studio, which is a nice feature to have and which is available starting Visual Studio 2012. So let's go ahead and add a break and then add a grid view control. Let's say run at server, and note that when I typed in run at server and Visual Studio suggests run at, and Visual Studio suggested server as a value for the attribute, the quotes already got filled in by default, which is another nice feature to have. So let's just give it an ID. ID equals toy categories, and note again the quotes. And if I position my cursor on the control itself, you'll see that I get this little squiggly, and if I position the mouse on the squiggly, you'll see that I get an arrow that brings up the wizard that corresponds to the grid view control. In previous versions of Visual Studio, this was only available in the design view, and what we've done in this version of Visual Studio is that we've allowed you to use all of the features that were available in the Visual Studio Designer also in code view. So you don't have to switch between design and source view. You can just directly do everything that you were doing in design view directly in source view. So I can now go ahead and choose a data source for my grid view if I wanted to from the data sources that were available on my page, or go ahead and edit the columns of my grid view directly. So I've already coded a few snippets of code which I'm going to add to my grid view to speed the project along. So let's just add some more code here to the grid view, and let's add some columns to the grid view as well. Just take the columns snippet, and then let's have a look at the code I've added. So you're already familiar with the ID tag. The page size is just going to say that this grid view is going to display 5 elements per page. It has a maximum width of 800 pixels. The data key names specifies the primary key of the table in a database that this grid view is going to be accessing. We are allowing paging. We are not auto-generating columns. We are not allowing sorting on this grid view for now. And the border width is 1. There are 2 tags which have been introduced in WebForms 4.5. The first one is the item type tag, and you see that this item type tag actually points to the web sample BLL model namespace to the toy category object. And this is an example of what is called strong model binding. Strong model binding means that I am actually going to be binding the grid view control to a strongly typed object. So not only am I going to be able to access the properties of this object, but the properties of the object toy category are going to be typed properties, as opposed to the eval statements which are used in previous versions of ASP.NET, which just evaluated to strings. The other new tag that's been introduced in ASP.NET 4.5 is the select method tag. This, as opposed to using data sources, which we could use in previous versions of ASP.NET, we are going to tell the grid view control that it should use or it should call a method called get categories, which is in the code behind of my page, to actually do the selection and displaying of data when the grid view is rendered onto the page. Now, previously I could use something like a SQL data source or an object data source or link data source to do this. Now I can just directly call methods in the code behind for my page to load data into the control. So the next step would just be to go into the code behind of my page and to actually add the get categories method. So let's jump into the code behind, and into the code behind what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a using statement. So I'm going to be saying using websample.bll.model to bring in my model classes, and then I'm just going to be declaring a page level variable which is representing the product context, and I'm going to be calling that _db. And the next stage is to just grab the snippet for the get categories method and paste it into my page. So as you can see, the get categories method is returning a type of iQueryable type collection of toy category, and the only thing that this method does is it does a call to the product context object which we've newed in the page variables, and it is calling its property method called toy categories. And remember, the toy categories gives back a DB set, a collection of type DB set toy category, which I'm going to be returning to the calling control, which is my grid view. Now, there's one more thing I would need to do before running the sample, and that is I'm going to go and modify a little bit my model classes. Let's start with the toy category class. So I'm going to be bringing in a namespace here as well. So I'm going to be saying using system.componentModel.data annotations, and this namespace contains attributes which can be used to decorate the properties of a model object to tell Entity Framework what columns, what type of columns it needs to generate when building out the table for this model object in the database. So I can explicitly tell Entity Framework that I want the category ID property, which is type int, to be a primary key by adding the key attribute to my decorating my category ID property with the key attribute. There are also some implicit conventions that I could use for Entity Framework, and if I had named my property, instead of just naming it category ID, if I had named it toy category ID, so the name of the object plus ID at the end, entity framework would have implicitly assumed, if there had been no attributes to decorate the property, that this would be the primary key. But I prefer to actually explicitly decorate the properties of my model classes with attributes to know what entity framework is going to be using them for. So in the same way, I'm going to be bringing in the namespace in the product class. So let's do that. Oops. And saying using system.componentModel.data annotations, and then I will be able to decorate the product ID property with the key attribute to indicate to entity framework that I want the product ID property of the product class to be used as a primary key. The same is true for the product picture class. So the I'm going to be actually grabbing the system.componentModel.data annotations and just decorating it with the key attribute here as well. So that's all I need to do. The solution should build out now, and if I run this in the browser, I should actually now be able to see my database being seeded, and the grid view control that I've just created should actually return data. So let's have a look. In order to access the categories page, I need to be authenticated, so I'm going to authenticate to my application using forms-based authentication. And then I should be able to go to the site administration folder into the categories page. And there we go. The categories page is going to return a grid view which contains the two categories that I have seeded into my database using the product model initializer class. So if I go back into SQL Server Management Studio and I look at my database, you can see that the web sample product store that now contains the three tables which correspond to my three entities, toy categories, products, and product pictures respectively. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to add a details view to show details of each category that I can select. To do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a second web form in my site administration folder. So to do that, I'm just going to right click and select add new item, and I'm going to be selecting a web form using master page. And I'm just going to call this category details. There we go. Click add and then select the site master page, and I have, exactly as I did in the categories page, I have a new web form. So let's put a heading here, and let's put a heading saying strong, and I'm going to say category details, and let's put a break behind that, and let's add a form view to the page so we can actually display details. And I'm going to call this category details, and let's just say I want it to run at server, just like all ASP.NET web forms controls. And you can see again that when Visual Studio parses this, I can get the squiggly, which brings up the wizard for the form view control, this time also in source view. So I'm just going to go back into my snippets here and grab the snippets for the form view this time for speed. So let's replace this with that and change the namespace. Web sample dot bll.model dot toy category, data key names category ID, default mode read only, because I'm only going to be displaying displaying the details of the particular category. And then the select method for this particular control is going to be called get category. Now let's put in the form view item template, which is going to be the template to used when the form view is in read-only mode. So there we go, I've pasted that in. And again, you note that this control is going to be strongly data binded to a toy category object, and it is going to be using a method in the code behind which is called get category to select the details of that particular category. So let's go into the code behind of the page, and the first thing I need to do, just like in the other one, is to bring in using web sample.bll.model to make my model classes accessible to the page, and then I am going to declare a context object. So let's declare a context object of type dbContext into the page level variables and new it up. And then I am just going to be pasting in the code for the toy category get categories. So let's just paste this method code in, and you'll see that I get red squigglies here, and the red squigglies here are because I need to bring in another namespace, which is using system. I need to use the system dot web dot model binding namespace to actually be able to get Visual Studio to recognize the query string attribute that I've put in the parameters of this method. So let's have a closer look at the get category method. The get category method returns an object of type toy category, and all it does is it calls the toy categories property of the DB of the product context object that I've newed up in the page variables, and it calls the find method on the toy categories collection to return the object with the specified ID, where the ID is a parameter passed in via the query string. Now, this notation with the attribute before int ID means that the method should actually go ahead and search for a variable called ID inside the query string which is passed to this page. Now note, I could also use other attributes like form, and this is going to go and search in the form variables collection, or something like session to go and look in the session variables collection that is passed to this page. But for now, let's use query string, and we'll modify this later. Right, so let's go back into the category details markup, and now what I'd like to do is to add the eval statements in here to actually display the name, the short description, the description, and the maybe even the last updated date. So let's just put in a new field in here for the last update. So we're going to change this into well, I already have one. All right, so that's superfluous. So let's add the eval statements. So to add the eval statements, we are going to be using these angle brackets, and then the hash sign, and then eval of name, and then here we're going to say angle brackets hash eval of short description. Make sure I spell that correctly. And another one of eval of description. And finally, in eval of last update. Oops. There we go. Now you'll notice that this syntax is rather awkward in the sense that I actually need to make sure that I did not make any spelling mistakes when entering these, because if I did, this sample is going to break. So let me just make sure that I have spelled these correctly, and the way that I do this is that I just have the tendency to copy each of the naming attributes from the class I've defined them into the markup, just to make sure that there haven't been any mistakes that are done. And I will show you later on a new feature in ASP.NET which allows us to bypass this and to do a much better job in doing the model binding. But for now, this is the traditional way that we did it, and I'm going to so you see I made a typo there, so it's last updated. And these notice that these attributes will be binded at runtime, and that even if I add in here name1, the designer is not going to complain. It's just is not going to detect any errors, because these errors are just going to be detected at runtime. So now I should be fine. And the last thing I need to add to make sure that everything works out is a way to redirect from the categories page onto the category details page. So to do that, I'm going to modify the grid view control that I already have, and I'm going to add a little bit more code in here. I'm going to add a template field to it. So the template field actually defines an item template, and in this item template I am going to define a hyperlink control, which I'm just going to be calling HPL category details. And in the HPL category details, I'm going to have to point the hyperlink via the navigate URL attribute, and I'm going to be using an eval statement with 2 parameters. So I'm actually going to be telling Visual Studio that I want it to evaluate the category ID of the category, and I want it, once it evaluates this, I want it to plug it into the category details.aspx $ID equals statement. And this is a really nitty-gritty way to do this, because if I get any one of these wrong, notice that these are all strings, so Visual Studio is not going to do any type checking on these or any checking at all. So now if I run this, I should actually be seeing my grid view augmented, and obviously since I did not save my login, I'm going to be redirected to the login page. I'm just going to log in again. And now you see that I get these 2 links in here, and one of them, if you look down at the bottom, says category details ASPX ID equals 1, and the second one says category details ASPX ID equals 2. So if I click on the one of these, what's going to happen is that I'm going to be redirected to the category details page. The category details page is going to load the forms view control. The form view control is going to be calling the get category method in the code behind. That's going to be looking at in the query string passed to the page for a parameter called ID and getting the value for that. And in this case, the value is ID equals 2, and then it's going to be looking for the category in the database which has the primary key equals to number 2, and it is going to be loading that into the item template of the control to be displayed. So this concludes this video on strongly typed data binding. The next video in the series is going to go deeper into strongly typed data binding and see and show how we can improve what we've done so far in the grid view and in the form view to augment the strongly typed data binding that is available in WebForms 4.5.